London, 1839. A family of 5 stands outside massive iron gates. The father lost his job 3 months ago. They've sold everything. They're starving. The children are skeletal. They have one choice left. Enter the workhouse. The gates open. The family walks in together. Within minutes, they're separated. Father to men's ward, mother to women's ward. Children torn from both parents, sent to children's quarters. They'll live under the same roof, but might not see each other for months. This is the rule. Families must be broken. Welcome to the Victorian workhouse. Britain's solution to poverty, where the poor weren't helped. They were punished. The system was designed deliberately. Make poverty so miserable that people would do anything to avoid it. Make the workhouse worse than the worst job, the worst wages, the worst conditions outside. This was called less eligibility. The workhouse must be less eligible, less desirable than any alternative. So people would only enter in absolute desperation. And they did. Hundreds of thousands. At any given time in Victorian Britain, over 100,000 people lived in workhouses. Children born there, elderly dying there, families destroyed there, lives ground down by institutional cruelty masquerading as charity. The workhouse wasn't ancient tradition. It was modern innovation, created by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, designed by bureaucrats, implemented by Parliament, supported by the wealthy who resented paying poor rates, opposed by the poor who understood what it meant. Before 1834, Britain had old poor law. Parishes gave outdoor relief, money or food to poor in their homes. Not generous, often inadequate, but it let families stay together, let people maintain dignity, let the temporarily unemployed survive without institutional confinement. The new poor law abolished outdoor relief, no more help at home. If you wanted assistance, you entered the workhouse. You surrendered freedom. You accepted separation from family. You submitted to prison-like conditions. You worked long hours at hard labor. You ate barely enough to survive. You lived under strict rules enforced by harsh punishment. Why? Economics and ideology. The wealthy paid poor rates, taxes supporting the poor. They wanted costs reduced. They believed outdoor relief encouraged laziness. They thought people chose poverty to get free money. They were wrong, but their beliefs shaped policy. The architects of the new poor law were political economists. Edwin Chadwick primarily. They believed in deterrence through suffering. Make poverty so unpleasant that rational people would work any job, accept any wage, rather than enter the workhouse. This would reduce poor rates. This would discipline labor. This would solve poverty by making the poor more desperate. It didn't solve poverty. It created hell for the poor. Victorian Britain was wealthiest nation on earth. The empire spanned continents. Industry boomed. Fortunes were made. London was global capital. But alongside magnificent wealth was crushing poverty. Millions lived one paycheck from starvation. Factory closures meant destitution. Illness meant catastrophe. Age meant abandonment. The workhouse was where capitalism's casualties went to die slowly. Charles Dickens knew this. Oliver Twist, published 1838, exposed workhouse horrors. Please, Sir, I Want Some More became immortal because it captured the deliberate starvation, the cruel officials, the institutional brutality, the children suffering. Dickens wrote from knowledge. His childhood included poverty. He understood, but Oliver Twist didn't close the workhouses. They operated until 1930, nearly a century of misery. Generations grew up knowing workhouse terror. The threat kept workers compliant. The fear kept families together at any cost. The reality destroyed hundreds of thousands of lives. This is the complete history of Victorian workhouses, not romanticized Dickens adaptation. The real system, how it worked, Who suffered? What happened inside those walls? The labor children performed, the starvation diet, the family separation, the punishment, the scandals, the resistance, the slow reform, the eventual abolition. Every aspect of workhouse life will be examined. The architectural design meant to intimidate, the uniform stripping identity, the work designed to break spirit, the food calculated to barely sustain life, the rules controlling every moment, the officials wielding absolute power, the deaths covered up, the bodies sold for dissection under the Anatomy Act. We'll hear from those who lived it, through their testimony before Parliament, through their letters, through their desperate attempts to resist, through their survival and their deaths. Before we enter the workhouse gates, subscribe to this channel. Mr. Ravenhurst creates comprehensive documentaries about histories that demand serious treatment. Victorian institutions, dark British history, social systems that destroyed lives. Topics most channels won't examine with necessary depth and research. Leave a comment about whether you'd have survived Victorian poverty, the workhouse, the alternative of starvation, the impossible choices the poor faced. Your engagement determines future research. Turn off the lights. This requires attention and some anger. Because what happened in Victorian workhouses was policy, deliberate, designed, supported by Parliament and society. This wasn't accident of history, this was choice. The workhouse gates stand open. Beyond them lies systematic cruelty, institutional suffering, Britain's shame. Let us enter. Chapter 1. The Poor Law of 1834. To understand workhouses, you must understand the law that created them. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, called the New Poor Law. It fundamentally changed how Britain treated poverty, not for the better. Before this act, England had old poor law dating to Elizabethan times. The system was local. Each parish cared for its own poor, funded through poor rates, local taxes. The relief came in various forms. Outdoor relief meant assistance given at home, money, food, fuel, clothing. It allowed poor to stay in their communities, maintain some autonomy, survive difficult times without imprisonment. Indoor relief also existed, parish workhouses, but these were smaller, less systematized, not yet the Victorian monsters they'd become. They housed the elderly, infirm, orphans. They weren't designed to punish all poverty. The Speen-Hamlin system, operating 1795 to 1834 in southern counties, supplemented wages. If a labourer earned less than subsistence, the parish made up difference. This kept families fed when wages were inadequate. Employers could pay low knowing parish would supplement. The system had flaws but prevented mass starvation. By 1830s, critics attacked outdoor relief and Speenhamland. They claimed it encouraged idleness. They said people had children to get more relief. They believed poverty was moral failing. They wanted discipline, deterrence, punishment. The wealthy who paid poor rates wanted costs reduced. Agricultural interests wanted wages driven down. Industrial capitalists wanted compliant labour. Political economists wanted free market principles applied to poverty. All these interests converged in support of poor law reform. A royal commission investigated poor relief, 1832 to 1834. Edwin Chadwick led it. The Commission's report painted outdoor relief as disaster. It cherry-picked evidence. It ignored testimony defending old system. It recommended abolishing outdoor relief entirely. It proposed one solution, the workhouse. The Commission insisted on less eligibility. Conditions inside workhouse must be worse than worst conditions outside. This would ensure only truly desperate entered. It would deter the lazy, they claimed. It would force people into any available work rather than seek relief. Parliament passed the Act in 1834. It wasn't popular with the poor. They understood immediately what it meant. Riots broke out, protests organized, but the act became law. The system was implemented despite resistance. The act created Poor Law Commission. 3 commissioners with enormous power. They designed workhouse system. They wrote regulations. They appointed local officials. They operated with minimal oversight. They answered to Parliament, but Parliament trusted them. The commissioners were true believers in deterrence through suffering. The Act mandated grouping parishes into unions. Each union would build workhouse, larger institutions serving multiple parishes. This created economy of scale, more efficient misery. The old parish workhouses were too small, too local, too humane. The new union workhouses would be proper institutions, purpose-built for deterrence. The commissioners issued detailed regulations, how workhouses should be built, how inmates should be classified, what work they'd perform, what food they'd receive, how families should be separated. Every aspect controlled. Standardized misery across England. The regulations required separating inmates by class: men, women, boys, girls, elderly and infirm. Each class housed separately, worked separately, ate separately. This meant families torn apart, husbands separated from wives, parents from children, siblings separated by sex. You might live in same building, but never see your family. The regulations specified diet, carefully calculated to provide minimum calories needed to prevent death while performing hard labor. Nothing more. Variety was minimal. Quality was poor. Quantity was measured precisely. The diet itself was punishment, monotonous, inadequate, designed to make people desperate to leave. Work was mandatory. The able-bodied would work all day. Men broke stones, picked oakum, performed hard, meaningless labor. Women picked oakum, cleaned, worked in laundry. Children worked half day, attended school half day, though school was minimal. Everyone worked, even the elderly unless completely infirm. Idleness wasn't allowed. Punishment for rule breaking was harsh. Reduction of food, solitary confinement, physical punishment authorized. Authority was absolute. Appeal was nearly impossible. Once inside workhouse walls, you were subject to complete control. The regulations tried to standardize everything, but local variation existed. Some workhouse masters were cruel, others marginally humane. Some boards of guardians, local authorities overseeing workhouses, were zealous in applying deterrence. Others more lenient, but the system's nature was punitive regardless of local variation. The Act's ideology was clear. Poverty was individual failing. The poor needed discipline. Suffering would motivate work. The workhouse would test genuineness of need. Those truly desperate would accept it. Those capable of work would avoid it by finding employment. This logic ignored economic reality. Jobs weren't always available. Wages weren't always adequate. Illness happened. Age happened. The economy's boom-bust cycles happened. But ideology ignored reality. The Act faced resistance. Anti-poor law movement was strong in northern England. Industrial workers organized against it. They saw it as assault on their security. They protested. They rioted. In some areas, implementation was delayed years by resistance, but eventually the Act was enforced. Workhouses were built. The system operated. By 1840, over 300 workhouses existed across England and Wales. By 1850, over 600. Each housed hundreds of inmates. At any time, 100,000 plus people lived in workhouses. Over a year, many more cycled through. Entered in desperate moments. Left when circumstances improved slightly, or never left. Died inside. The Act was extended to Ireland during the Great Famine. Workhouses built while millions starved. The system's cruelty in Ireland was even more extreme. desperate Irish poor flooded into workhouses during famine, died there in enormous numbers. The workhouse system during Irish famine was genocide, facilitated by bureaucracy. Scotland had separate system, less harsh initially, but still based on deterrence, still designed to make poverty miserable, still separated families and enforced discipline through deprivation. The Poor Law Commissioners, later replaced by Poor Law Board in 1847, collected statistics. They documented everything: admissions, deaths, costs, births in workhouses, children bound as apprentices. The system generated paperwork, bureaucracy, reports, all preserving record of systematic cruelty. The commissioners insisted the system worked. They pointed to reduced costs, fewer people claiming relief. This they called success. They ignored that people starved rather than enter workhouse, that families struggled in desperate poverty to avoid separation, that people died of preventable causes rather than seek help. The commissioners measured success in money saved, not lives preserved. Critics attacked the system from the start, Dickens most famously, but also social reformers, doctors who saw workhouse conditions, clergy who witnessed suffering, radical politicians. The Times newspaper ran exposés. Parliamentary investigations occasionally occurred, but change was slow. The system was entrenched. The Act remained in force until 1929. The workhouses continued operating until 1940s, the National Assistance Act. 1948 finally abolished the poor law system. Over a century of operation, millions cycled through, hundreds of thousands died in workhouses, countless families destroyed, all because 1834 Parliament decided poverty should be punished, not relieved. The Poor Law of 1834 wasn't aberration. It was logical outcome of Victorian values: self-reliance, individual responsibility, free market. These principles applied ruthlessly to poverty created institutional hell. The workhouse was capitalism's answer to its own casualties: not help, not support, punishment, deterrence, suffering. Understanding this law is essential to understanding workhouse horror. The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was policy. The suffering wasn't regrettable necessity, it was intentional deterrent. The Poor Law of 1834 designed misery. The workhouses delivered it efficiently for generations. Chapter 2: Architecture of Intimidation. The workhouse was designed to terrify before you entered. The architecture was deliberate, imposing, prison-like. Every element communicated the same message: abandon hope. Most Victorian workhouses followed similar plans: large buildings, austere, institutional, visible from distance, often positioned on town edges where poor approached. You saw it coming. You knew what awaited. The typical design was cruciform, 4 wings radiating from central hub. Each wing housed different class of inmate: men's ward, women's ward, boys, girls, elderly and infirm, imbeciles as they were called. The design enforced separation. You couldn't pass between wings without going through central area where officials watched. The front was fortress-like: high walls, heavy iron gates, porter's lodge at entrance. You didn't just walk into workhouse, you were admitted, processed. The entrance ritual was humiliation by design. The entrance hall was stark, stone floors, whitewashed walls, no decoration, no comfort, everything designed to strip dignity immediately. George Godwin, architectural journalist, described typical workhouse entrance in 1865. The aspect is that of a prison. The high walls, the heavy gates, the grated windows, all speak of confinement rather than refuge. This was intentional. The architecture was a moral lesson. You had failed. You were being contained. The central hub where wings met contained offices, boardroom where guardians met, master's quarters, matron's rooms, medical officer's space when one existed. This central control allowed surveillance of all wings, the panopticon principle. Authority at center, inmates at periphery, always watched, always controlled. Windows were high and barred, rooms were cells, corridors were narrow, ceilings were tall, creating echo that made buildings feel even more institutional. Heating was minimal, workhouses were cold, deliberately. Comfort wasn't goal, deterrence was. Many workhouses included punishment cells, small rooms, dark, unheated, used for solitary confinement. These were essentially prison cells within workhouse, reserved for those who broke rules, who resisted, who complained. The existence of punishment cells revealed workhouse's true nature. Not refuge, prison. The wards where inmates slept were dormitories, long rooms, rows of beds, sometimes individual beds, sometimes shared, sometimes just wooden platforms with thin mattresses. Privacy didn't exist. Possessions weren't allowed. You slept surrounded by strangers in institutional space. Women's wards housed women and girls under 16. Men's wards housed men and boys over 13. Young boys aged 7 to 13 had separate ward. Girls 7 to 16 separate ward. Children under 7 stayed with mothers. This meant 7-year-old boys were separated from mothers, sent to boys' ward. 7-year-old girls could stay with mothers if mothers were in workhouse, but boys were torn away. The elderly and infirm had separate wards. These were often worst conditions, understaffed, neglected. The old died in these wards regularly. Some workhouses had separate infirmary wards. Others just kept sick in regular wards where disease spread easily. Idiots and imbeciles, people with mental disabilities or learning difficulties, had separate wards. Conditions there were often horrific, minimal care, poor treatment. These inmates were largely forgotten once segregated. The work areas were industrial. Men's yards had stone-breaking piles, oakum-picking rooms, bone-crushing equipment. Women had laundry facilities, sewing rooms, picking rooms. Children had schoolrooms, though these were often inadequate. Work dominated life. The architecture reflected this, more space for labor than rest. Dining halls were communal but segregated. Men ate separately from women, children separately. Even during meals, families couldn't be together. The halls were bare, long tables, benches, no decoration. Meals eaten in silence often. Rules prohibited conversation in some workhouses. The chapel was often a central feature. Religion was important to authorities. Attendance was mandatory. The chapel architecture usually reflected broader institutional aesthetic. Plain, austere, uncomfortable pews, long sermons. Christianity as social control. Outside spaces were minimal. Yards for exercise. High-walled to prevent seeing out or communication with outside world. No gardens for inmates usually. Some workhouses had burial grounds on site, pauper graves, unmarked, mass burials. You could die and be buried without leaving workhouse grounds. The whole design communicated powerlessness. From moment you approached gates to moment you died in infirmary ward, the architecture reminded you had failed, you were controlled, you had no agency, you were institutionalized. Some workhouses were even more prison-like. Separate system workhouses, built 1840s, isolated inmates completely. Individual cells, no communication between inmates, work in solitude, eat alone, sleep alone, complete isolation as deterrent. These proved so harsh that even authorities acknowledged they went too far. But standard workhouses were plenty harsh without total isolation. The buildings still stand. Many Victorian workhouses survive as hospitals, administrative buildings, apartments. Walking through them today, you feel the institutional weight, the high ceilings, the long corridors, the cell-like rooms. The architecture speaks even now of social control through spatial design. The poor understood the message. The workhouse building itself was threat. Parents warned children, behave or you'll end up in workhouse. Workers feared job loss because it meant workhouse. The elderly dreaded ending days there. The architecture succeeded in creating fear. That was its purpose. Some architects argued for more humane designs. Reformers suggested workhouses needn't look like prisons. But the Poor Law Board insisted on intimidating architecture. It served deterrence. It reduced costs by discouraging admissions. It worked as intended. People avoided workhouses partly because the buildings themselves were so grim. The architecture of intimidation was Victorian social policy made physical. Poverty wasn't conditioned to alleviate. It was failing to punish. The workhouse building embodied this philosophy. Every brick, every barred window, every locked gate, every cold corridor, all designed to make poverty so miserable that people would do anything to avoid it. But poverty doesn't work that way. You can't choose not to be poor when there are no jobs. You can't work when you're too old or too sick. You can't feed your family when wages don't cover food. The workhouse's architectural intimidation didn't solve poverty. It just made the poor suffer more while poor. The buildings remain as monuments to institutional cruelty, to policies that punish the vulnerable, to architecture used as weapon against the desperate. The Victorian workhouse building is historical artifact that makes visitors uncomfortable even now, because it reveals how society can design spaces specifically to break human spirit. And did. Chapter 3. Admission and classification. Entering the workhouse was process designed to strip identity and dignity completely. You arrived at gates desperate. You'd exhausted all alternatives, sold everything, borrowed from everyone, tried every possible job. Now you had no choice. Starvation or the workhouse. The admission process began at Porter's lodge. You stated your case to Porter, why you needed relief, your circumstances, your desperation. The porter decided whether to admit you or send you away. This initial judgment was arbitrary. Some porters were sympathetic, others cruel. Your fate depended on their mood. If admitted, you waited. Sometimes hours, in waiting room or outside. You waited to see the master, the workhouse's chief administrator, or the relieving officer who handled admissions. While waiting, you contemplated what came next. Everyone knew: family separation, loss of freedom, institutional life. The master or relieving officer interviewed you. Interrogation more than interview. They asked invasive questions. Why were you poor? Why couldn't you work? Where was your family? What happened to your possessions? The questions implied moral failing, poverty as personal fault. You had to justify your need, prove your desperation. They recorded information in admission register: name, age, former occupation, reason for seeking relief, previous workhouse stays if any, whether you could read, whether you had family, all documented. You became entry in ledger, no longer person, administrative problem. If they decided to admit you, the real humiliation began. You were taken to receiving ward, men to one area, women to another. If you arrived as family, this was where separation started. Husbands taken from wives, children over 7 taken from mothers. The separation was immediate and traumatic. You were required to bathe. The bath was communal often. Multiple people in same water. The bath was cold usually. Not enough hot water or fuel to heat it properly. You bathed while supervised. Privacy wasn't consideration. The bath was delousing as much as cleaning. Assumed you carried vermin. Probably you did. The poor often had lice, fleas. Living rough meant lack of hygiene. After bathing, your clothes were taken, your own clothes, everything you wore, taken away, fumigated or destroyed. You wouldn't see them again unless you left workhouse. Your clothes were identity. personal history, connection to outside world, all removed. You were given workhouse uniform. For men, rough jacket, waistcoat, trousers, made of coarse material, usually brown or grey. For women, dress, apron, cap, plain, shapeless, made to fit no one specifically. Children got similar institutional uniforms. Everyone looked the same. Individuality erased. The uniform was deliberately uncomfortable. Rough fabric that chafed, poorly fitted, humiliating to wear. It marked you as pauper, as workhouse inmate. If you somehow got outside, everyone would know immediately what you were. The uniform was scarlet letter, badge of poverty and failure. Your possessions, if you had any, were taken, stored or confiscated. You couldn't keep personal items in most workhouses. No photographs, no letters, no mementos, nothing from your previous life. You entered institutional existence with nothing, owning nothing, being nothing. You were then classified. The poor law regulations required 7 classes. Class 1, aged and infirm men. Class 2, able-bodied men over 13. Class 3, boys 7 to 13. Class 4, aged and infirm women. Class 5, able-bodied women over 16. Class 6, girls 7 to 16. Class 7, children under 7. Each class was housed separately, worked separately, lived separately. If you came as family, you were now divided across different classes. Your 7-year-old son taken to boys' ward, your wife to women's ward, you to men's ward. Your toddler stayed with your wife. You might not see your wife again for months, your son even longer. Some workhouses had additional classifications. Imbeciles and idiots, people with mental disabilities were separated. Pregnant women and nursing mothers sometimes had separate ward. Sick people went to infirmary wards if workhouse had them. The classification system divided humanity into administrative categories. Your needs as individual didn't matter. You fit into class. That determined everything. You were assigned bed in your class's dormitory, assigned work detail, given schedule to follow. Your day was now structured completely by institution. You'd wake when told, eat when told, work when told, rest when told, sleep when told. No autonomy, no choice. Complete institutional control. The admission process was designed to be humiliating. It broke you down, stripped identity, separated you from family, took your clothes, took your possessions, took your freedom, classified you as category of dependent humanity, rendered you powerless. For children born in workhouse, there was no admission process. They were born into classification system, born as paupers, given workhouse birth certificate. Never knew anything but institutional life unless they were eventually released or apprenticed out. For those re-entering workhouse after previous stays, the process was familiar horror. Each time, the same humiliation. Each time, the same separation from family. Each time, the same loss of self. Chronic poverty meant repeated admissions. Cycles of entering workhouse, getting back on feet, struggling outside, falling into poverty again, re-entering. Each cycle destroyed dignity further. The elderly often entered knowing they'd never leave. Their admission was surrender. They were too old to work, too frail. No family to care for them. The workhouse would be where they died. Their admission was entering tomb. They knew this. The process acknowledged it by classifying them immediately as aged and infirm, category of those waiting to die. Women fleeing abuse sometimes sought workhouse as refuge, better institutional cruelty than domestic violence. But admission process didn't recognize this. No special accommodation for victims. They were just paupers like others, classified, uniformed, institutionalized. The admission process occasionally included medical examination, supposed to determine fitness for work. In practice, cursory check. Doctor rarely available. Sick people admitted to general wards where they infected others. Medical screening was often nominal, just paperwork requirement. Some masters made admission deliberately difficult, delayed processing, asked hostile questions, attempted to deter entry. The Poor Law Board officially required workhouses to admit all who applied, but local officials found ways to discourage applications, making process lengthy, humiliating, difficult. The admission process was also gendered in effects. Women experienced particular humiliation, forced bathing supervised by others, uniform dresses that stripped femininity, separation from children often permanent for mothers of boys over 7. Women's powerlessness was even more complete than men's. Once admitted, you were inmate, not resident, not guest. Inmate, prison terminology, prison reality. The admission process transforms citizen, however poor, into institutional dependent, person into category, human into number in register. The registers survive. Thousands of volumes, names of millions who entered workhouses over century. Each name represents person who exhausted all alternatives, who faced starvation, who sacrificed freedom for survival, who endured humiliation of admission process, who lost family, clothes, identity to enter institutional hell. The admission process was gateway to systematic dehumanization. It was designed carefully, implemented consistently. Its purpose was clear: strip away everything that made you individual, render you dependent, controllable, compliant, make you regret poverty so thoroughly that you'd never, if you could possibly avoid it, be poor again. It worked as psychological torture, but it didn't solve poverty. It just made the poor suffer more while being poor. Chapter 4: Daily Life, Rules and Routine. Life in the workhouse was regimented completely. Every hour scheduled, every action controlled. Rules governed everything. The day began early, 5 a.m. in summer, 6 a.m. in winter. Bell rang. Everyone rose immediately. No lingering in bed allowed. You dressed in your workhouse uniform, made your bed to institutional standards, stood ready for inspection. Morning prayers were usually mandatory. March to chapel, sit in assigned pew. Your class sat together, men in one section, women in another, children elsewhere, separated even in prayer. The service was brief: prayers for moral improvement, hymns about accepting suffering, religion as social control. After prayers, breakfast, march to dining hall, still segregated. Men's tables, women's tables, children's tables. You sat in assigned seat, waited in silence. Masters and officials watched for violations. Breakfast was meager: bread, weak tea or gruel. Exact amounts specified by regulations, measured precisely. Nothing extra. You ate quickly, in silence often. Rules against conversation during meals common in many workhouses. Eating wasn't social activity, just biological necessity. After breakfast, work began. This was core of workhouse life. Labor for able-bodied was mandatory. 7 to 8 hours daily typically. The work varied by sex and age. Men's work was deliberately hard and pointless. Stone breaking was common. You sat in yard, were given pile of stones, broke them into smaller stones with hammer. The broken stones had little use. Sometimes they were sold for road material. Usually they were broken just to give you hard labor. It was Sisyphean task. Break stones, get more stones, break them, forever. Oakum picking was another male task. Oakum is old rope tarred and used in ships. Picking oakum meant untwisting old rope fiber by fiber. Your fingers bled. The tar was toxic. The work was tedious beyond description. Hour after hour, day after day, pulling apart old rope. The picked oakum was sold to shipyards, but mainly it was chosen because it was miserable work that required no skill and served deterrence. Bone crushing was practiced in some workhouses, crushing animal bones for fertilizer. The smell was horrible. The work was disgusting. The dust was probably harmful to lungs, but it kept men busy, kept them suffering, kept them deterred. Corn grinding was another task, turning mill by hand, hour after hour. The work was exhausting, monotonous. Some mills were treadmills, literally, men walking endlessly on revolving steps, powering mill by walking, Victorian treadmill as punishment machine. Women's work was different, but no less hard. Laundry was major female task. The workhouse laundry was industrial operation, washing clothes for all inmates, sometimes taking in outside laundry for income. Women spent all day washing, scrubbing, wringing, hanging, ironing. Their hands were raw, their backs ached. The work was never ending. Oakum picking was also women's work. Same miserable task as men. Sitting for hours pulling apart rope. Fingers bleeding, tedium absolute. Sewing was common. Mending institutional clothes. Making uniforms. Sewing mailbags for post office. Hours of close work. Eye strain, repetitive motion. Paid nothing. Your labor generated income for workhouse. You received only subsistence. Kitchen work was also female labor. Cooking institutional meals. Preparing exact portions specified by regulations. Washing hundreds of dishes. Scrubbing floors. The work was hard and constant. Kitchen work at least had benefit of occasional extra food. Cooks could sometimes sneak portions. Supplement starvation rations. Cleaning was endless female task. The workhouse was large. Institutional cleaning was constant. Scrubbing floors. Washing windows. Cleaning dormitories. Cleaning dining halls. Cleaning everything. Always. Children worked too. Boys over 7 worked half day. Agricultural work on workhouse farms if they existed. Light manufacturing. Oakum picking. Breaking stones. Whatever useful labor could be extracted from children. Girls worked in laundry, in kitchen, sewing, cleaning, domestic training, preparing them for service positions. The work was real. Not play, not light duty. Children worked hard. Children were supposed to attend school half day. The poor law required basic education, but schools in workhouses were minimal, poorly staffed, inadequate materials. Teachers were often other inmates, barely literate themselves. Education was afterthought. Work was priority. The elderly and infirm were exempt from hard labor only if truly incapable. If you could move, you worked. Light tasks. Picking oakum was considered suitable for elderly. Their arthritic fingers struggled, but they picked oakum or faced punishment for idleness. Work stopped for dinner, midday meal, march to dining hall, segregated eating, measured portions, silence, bland food, then back to work. Afternoon was more labor, same tasks, same tedium, same supervision, same suffering. The work never accomplished anything meaningful. It existed to keep you busy, to tire you, to break your spirit, to make workhouse so unpleasant you'd do anything to leave. Work ended around 6 p.m, then supper. Another meager meal, bread, cheese sometimes, tea, measured portions, segregated eating, rules, silence. After supper, a few hours before bed. This was only slightly free time. You couldn't leave your ward, couldn't visit family in other wards, couldn't go outside usually. You sat in day room. Some workhouses allowed reading if you could read and if materials existed. Most didn't. Conversation was monitored, topics were limited, politics forbidden, complaints forbidden. You sat, talked about nothing important, waited for sleep. Evening prayers sometimes occurred. Another march to chapel. More institutional religion, more social control disguised as spiritual care. Bed at 8 p.m, bell rang. March to dormitory, undress, into bed, lights out, silence, sleep. The guards patrolled, making sure of quiet, making sure of obedience. This was every day, 7 days a week after week, month after month, for some, year after year. The routine never changed, the tedium was crushing. The lack of autonomy was absolute. Sunday was slightly different. More chapel time, less work. but also more boredom. Sunday was day off from labor, but offered nothing to fill time. You sat, you waited, you endured. The rules governing this routine were extensive. Written rules posted, enforced strictly. Rules against talking during meals. Rules against leaving your ward without permission. Rules against possessing anything unauthorized. Rules against complaining. Rules against questioning authority. Rules against malingering. Rules against everything. Punishment for rule violations was harsh. Loss of meals, reduction of already inadequate food, solitary confinement in punishment cell, physical punishment authorized for children, adults too in practice. The master had nearly absolute authority. He could punish almost any violation severely. Some rules were petty tyranny, rules about how you held your spoon, how you folded your blanket, how you stood during inspection. Rules designed to give officials excuses to punish, to remind you constantly of your powerlessness. The routine was deliberately monotonous, deliberately tedious, deliberately soul-crushing. It wasn't accident that workhouse life was so grim. It was carefully designed deterrent. Make every hour so miserable that you'd never choose this if any alternative existed. But for many, no alternative existed. You couldn't leave until circumstances changed, until job was found, until family could help, until you were too old or sick to leave. Some stayed years, some died there. The routine was their entire life. Wake, pray, eat, work, pray, sleep, repeat, until death. The psychological damage was enormous. The institutional routine destroyed initiative, destroyed independence. After months or years in workhouse, you were institutionalized. You'd forgotten how to live free, how to make decisions, how to function in outside world. The workhouse achieved its purpose. It made you compliant, dependent, broken. Former inmates struggled after release. They'd become accustomed to routine, to being told what to do every moment. Freedom was frightening. They often ended up back in workhouse. Cycle repeated. Enter, endure routine, leave, struggle, return. The workhouse created dependency it claimed to prevent. Children who grew up in this routine knew nothing else. Born in workhouse, raised in workhouse, educated in workhouse. They knew no other life. When they left, usually as teenage apprentices, they entered world they didn't understand. Many failed, returned. The routine had prepared them for nothing but more institutional life. The daily routine of Victorian workhouse was an efficient machine for destroying human spirit while keeping body barely alive. It was cruelty systematized, suffering scheduled, misery made bureaucratic. Every rule, every bell, every mandatory chapel service, every silent meal, every hour of pointless labor, all designed to punish poverty, to deter the desperate, to make want of want. It worked as deterrent. People avoided workhouse desperately. They starved rather than enter. They died in streets rather than surrender to routine. The routine was that bad. Society knew it was that bad. That was the point. Chapter 5. The Starvation Diet. Food in the workhouse was calculated carefully, not to nourish, to sustain life at minimum cost. The diet was starvation by design. The Poor Law Commission specified exact diets. Regional variations existed, but all followed same principle. Enough calories to prevent death while performing hard labor, nothing more. No variety, no quality, no pleasure. Food as fuel. Measured, monotonous, miserable. A typical adult male diet per day. Breakfast, 6 ounces of bread, 1.5 pints of gruel or weak tea. Dinner, vegetable soup or stew. Occasional small portion of meat, perhaps 3 times weekly. Bread, water. Supper, 6 ounces of bread, 1.5 pints of tea or thin porridge. This provided roughly 2,200 calories. Just barely enough for man doing hard labor. no excess, no margin. If you were sick, this was inadequate. If weather was cold, you needed more. If you were young and growing, you needed more. The diet didn't account for individual needs. Everyone got same portions regardless. Women received slightly less, children proportionally less still. The elderly and infirm received smaller portions. The assumption was less work meant less food needed. But the elderly often needed nutrition most. They got least. The quality was terrible. Bread was often stale, sometimes moldy, made with cheap flour, heavy, difficult to digest. It filled stomach without nourishing body. Gruel was thin porridge, oatmeal and water, sometimes milk, usually watered down. It was unappetizing, barely flavored, grey slop that sustained but didn't satisfy. The soup was thin, mostly water. Vegetables were whatever was cheapest, often turnips, sometimes carrots or onions, potato if lucky. The vegetables were boiled until nutrition was largely destroyed. The broth was weak, fat-free, unsalted, tasteless. Meat, when provided, was minimal. Offal often. Organ meat, lowest quality cuts. Fat removed, cooked until tough. The portions were measured precisely. 2 ounces, 3 ounces at most. Enough to say meat was provided, not enough to truly nourish. Cheese appeared occasionally, small portions. Hard cheese that was probably going off. It added calories, nothing more. Tea was weak, leaves reused multiple times, barely flavored. Hot water with hint of tea taste. No sugar, no milk usually, just weak tea. Water was available always. It was often contaminated. Workhouse wells weren't always clean. Waterborne diseases spread, but water was free and unlimited. There was no salt provided. The food was completely unseasoned. Salt was luxury, cost money. Workhouse food was deliberately bland. Some historians argue this was to prevent inmates enjoying meals. Deterrence through tastelessness. There was no variation. Every day, same food. Week after week, month after month, year after year. Same bread, same gruel, same thin soup, same tiny meat portion, same weak tea. The monotony was deliberate. Varied diet would suggest care. The workhouse didn't care. It sustained life. That was sufficient. The quantities were measured obsessively. Every portion weighed. Every inmate received exact amount specified. No seconds, no extras. If you were still hungry after eating your rations, you stayed hungry. There was no more food. The meals were eaten in silence usually. Rules against conversation made meals even more miserable. You sat at table, ate your inadequate bland food, in silence, surrounded by others doing same. Then meals ended. Food was cleared. You left hungry. Still. Children's portions were proportionally smaller. A child received perhaps half-adult portion, but children were growing. They needed nutrition. They got subsistence. Workhouse children were noticeably smaller than children outside, stunted by malnutrition. The diet wasn't adequate for development. Pregnant women needed extra nutrition. Nursing mothers needed extra calories. The workhouse diet didn't account for this adequately. Women gave birth malnourished. Babies were born underweight. Infant mortality in workhouses was significantly higher than outside, partly because mothers were starving. The sick needed better nutrition to recover. They received the same portions as healthy. Sometimes slightly different food, if doctor ordered it. But resources were limited. Sick diet was still inadequate. People died in workhouse infirmaries, partly from starvation. The elderly needed nutrition to maintain declining health. They received reduced portions because they worked less. Many elderly inmates were essentially starving slowly. Malnutrition contributed to death. The dietary regulations were justified as preventing idleness. Officials argued that generous food would attract people to workhouse, make it too comfortable, encourage pauperism. So food had to be just barely adequate, unappealing, insufficient, to deter. Inmates constantly complained about food. In testimony before parliamentary committees, in letters to newspapers, to visiting officials, the complaints were consistent: not enough, poor quality, monotonous. Hunger was universal, ignored. Some workhouse masters embezzled food funds, bought cheapest, lowest quality food, pocketed difference. Inmates ate worse, so officials profited. Scandals erupted periodically when this was discovered. But it continued. The temptation was too great, the oversight too minimal. The Andover workhouse scandal of 1846 exposed starvation directly. Inmates were so hungry they fought over scraps of rotting meat left on bones they were crushing. They sucked the marrow, ate the gristle, gnawed the bones. This wasn't animal behavior. This was starvation. When scandal broke, Parliament investigated, found the master had reduced rations below regulations, kept food money. The inmates were literally starving while he profited. The scandal led to some reforms. The Poor Law Commission was abolished, replaced by Poor Law Board with more oversight. Dietary regulations were slightly improved, but fundamentally, the starvation diet continued, because it was intentional, not accident. Some workhouses provided Christmas dinner, one decent meal per year, perhaps roast meat, vegetables, pudding. This annual meal highlighted how inadequate regular diet was. Once a year you ate properly. Rest of year you starved slowly. Outside charities sometimes donated food, Christmas gifts, occasional treats. These were welcomed desperately. They were also rare. Most of the year you ate workhouse rations. Only workhouse rations. The diet was class marker too. The poor ate this. The wealthy ate abundantly. The contrast was visible. Officials ate well. Masters had separate dining. Guardians when visiting had proper meals. Inmates watched them eat real food, while they ate gruel. The inequality was obvious, intentional. The psychological damage of constant hunger is difficult to overstate. You think about food constantly when you're hungry. Your ability to concentrate diminishes. Your energy falls. Your health degrades. Constant moderate starvation over months or years destroys health, weakens immunity, makes you susceptible to disease. Diseases of malnutrition appeared, scurvy from lack of vitamin C. The diet had almost no fresh fruit or vegetables. Anemia from lack of iron. The tiny meat portions and lack of variety meant insufficient iron. Rickets in children from lack of vitamin D and calcium. Malnutrition diseases that were preventable with proper diet. Workhouse inmates looked different, thin, pale, unhealthy. You could identify a workhouse pauper by appearance. The diet marked you physically, made your poverty visible on your body. The starvation diet worked as deterrent. People knew they'd go hungry in workhouse. They avoided it. Families struggled and starved at home, rather than enter institutional starvation. The diet's cruelty served policy goal: keep people out, reduce costs. But for those inside, the diet was daily torture. Going to bed hungry every night, waking hungry every morning, eating food that barely sustained you, never being full, never having variety, never having quality, just enough to keep working, keep existing, keep suffering. The Victorian workhouse diet was nutritional cruelty. It was deliberate, calculated, measured precisely to be inadequate, to punish, to deter, to remind you constantly of your failure by keeping you always hungry. Modern readers might wonder why inmates didn't refuse to work if underfed. They tried, but refusing work meant punishment, meant even less food, meant solitary confinement. You worked despite hunger, because alternative was worse hunger. The system trapped you. Damned if you worked, more damned if you didn't. The starvation diet of Victorian workhouse was abuse disguised as policy. cruelty justified as necessity, hunger weaponized as deterrent. It kept costs down, kept inmates weak, kept them compliant, kept them desperate to leave. It worked exactly as designed, and thousands died from it, slowly, hungrily, in Britain's workhouses. Chapter 6. Labour, breaking bodies and spirits. Work in the workhouse wasn't rehabilitation. It wasn't job training. It was punishment. It was designed to break you physically and spiritually. The Poor Law required able-bodied inmates to work, not as opportunity, as obligation, as price of relief. You worked because you were poor, because you needed help, because you had no choice. The work wasn't for your benefit. It was for deterrence, for discipline, for suffering. The jobs assigned to men were deliberately chosen for hardness and pointlessness. Stone breaking was archetypal. You sat in yard in all weather, were given a pile of large stones, given a hammer, told to break them into smaller pieces, specific size, measured. When you finished a pile, you got another pile, and another, forever. The work destroyed hands. Calluses formed, then wore through. Blisters, blood, cuts from stone fragments. The hammer's impact hurt wrists, elbows, shoulders. Hour after hour of repetitive striking. The pain became constant. Your body adjusted but never stopped hurting. The work was outside usually, in cold, in rain, in heat, no shelter. You sat on ground or low bench, broke stones, wet, cold, miserable. The weather added to suffering. In winter, your hands went numb. You broke stones anyway. In summer, the sun beat down. You broke stones anyway. The broken stones had minimal value. Sometimes they were sold for road surfacing. Sometimes they were just moved to another pile. The point wasn't economic. The point was making you break stones. Hard, meaningless, monotonous, soul-crushing work. Oakum picking was equally miserable. Old tarred rope was delivered to workhouse. You were given piece, told to unpick it, pull apart the fibres, separate them completely. The tar made it difficult. The fibres were thick. Your fingers bled. The tar got under fingernails, caused infections. Your hands were constantly sore. The picked oakum was sold to shipyards. It had actual economic value, but the work was chosen primarily for how unpleasant it was. Sitting for 8 hours pulling apart old rope. The tedium was absolute. Your mind wandered. Time crawled. You thought about everything you'd lost, everyone you missed, how you ended up here. The mental torture accompanied physical pain. Some workhouses had bone crushing, crushing old animal bones for fertilizer. The smell was indescribable. Rotting bone. The dust was probably harmful. You breathed it all day. The work was disgusting, degrading, chosen for that reason. Treadmills existed in some workhouses. Victorian treadmill was punishment device. Large wheel with steps. You climbed endlessly. The wheel turned. Powered mill grinding corn or pumping water. But mainly it exhausted you. Walking uphill forever. Going nowhere. The treadmill was torture. Some men collapsed on it. Were punished for malingering. Corn grinding by hand mill was another task. Turning heavy millstone by hand. Hour after hour. The work was exhausting. Your arms, shoulders, back ached constantly. The monotony was crushing. Turn handle. Grind corn. Turn handle. All day, every day. Some workhouses had labour yards where inmates processed materials for profit, picking apart old clothes for fibre, sorting rags, dismantling machinery. Any task that required manual labour but no skill could be assigned. The goal was keeping you busy, keeping you tired, keeping you broken. Women's work was different, but equally hard. The workhouse laundry was industrial operation. Washing was done by hand. Huge tubs of water. Lye soap that burned skin. Hours of scrubbing. Clothes from all inmates. Sometimes contracts to launder for outside institutions, prisons, hospitals, bringing in income for workhouse, paying inmates nothing. The physical strain was enormous, lifting heavy wet clothes, wringing them by hand, hanging them, taking them down, ironing with heavy irons heated on stoves. The work was hot in summer, cold in winter, steam and moisture everywhere. Women's hands were perpetually raw, skin cracked, bleeding. The work never ended. The laundry was constant. Oakum picking was assigned to women too. Same miserable task, same bleeding fingers, same tedium. Women sat in picking rooms, rows of women, pulling apart rope, in silence usually. Hours passing slowly, the work destroying hands while destroying spirits. Sewing was endless, mending workhouse clothes, making new uniforms, sewing mailbags on contract for post office, sewing sacks, any sewing work that could generate income or save costs. Women sewed for hours, eyes straining in poor light, backs aching from hunching, fingers sore from needles and thread. The repetitive motion caused pain. The clothes work caused headaches. The monotony caused despair. Kitchen work was hard physical labor, cooking for hundreds, large pots, heavy, lifting, stirring. Preparing institutional meals required strength. The heat was oppressive. The hours were long. Kitchen workers started before dawn, ended after supper cleanup. The work was exhausting, but at least kitchen workers sometimes got slightly more food, could sneak bites while cooking. This made kitchen work preferred assignment despite difficulty. Cleaning was constant. The institution was large. Dormitories needed daily cleaning. Dining halls after each meal, corridors, chapel, offices, infirmary, everywhere. Women scrubbed floors on hands and knees, washed windows, cleaned constantly. The work was back-breaking, never finished, always more to clean. Children worked too. The poor law required some education, half-day school, half-day work. But the school was often minimal. The work was real. Boys over 7 did light agricultural work if workhouse had farm, picked oakum, broke small stones, did simple manufacturing tasks. Girls worked in laundry, in kitchen, sewing, cleaning. The work was age-appropriate in theory. In practice, children worked hard. The education children received was poor compensation. The school teachers were often inmates themselves, barely literate. Teaching materials were minimal. The school was often just room where children sat, maybe learned alphabet, maybe learned to read simple words. The education didn't prepare them for anything except more poverty. Children were also hired out as labor. Some workhouses contracted children to factories, to farms, to workshops. The children worked outside workhouse but were still workhouse inmates. The contracting institution paid workhouse. Children received nothing. They worked, earned money for workhouse, returned to institutional poverty. This was legal child labor trafficking, sanctioned by poor law. The elderly who could work at all worked. Light tasks, supposedly. But the elderly picked oakum, sewed, cleaned, did whatever they physically could. No retirement existed in workhouse. You worked until incapable. Then you sat, waited to die. The work kept you marginally useful, marginally productive, marginally alive. The disabled were expected to work if possible. One-armed men picked oakum with one hand. The blind performed tasks by feel. Unless completely incapacitated, you worked. The definition of incapacity was narrow. If you could move at all, you could work something. The pace of work was controlled. Quotas existed. Daily amounts of oakum to pick, stones to break, laundry to complete. If you didn't meet quota, you were punished. Food reduced, punishment cell. The quota ensured maximum labor extraction. You couldn't slow down, couldn't rest, had to maintain pace despite exhaustion, despite pain. Supervision was constant. Taskmaster watched men's yards. Matrons supervised women's work. They reported malingering, reported insufficient effort. The officials determined if you were working hard enough. Their judgment was arbitrary. If they didn't like you, you were always malingering, always insufficient, always punishable. The injuries from work were common. Broken bones from stone fragments, cuts, infections from tar, back injuries from lifting, repetitive strain injuries, heat exhaustion in laundry. No compensation existed, no workers' rights. You were injured performing forced labor. Too bad. You kept working if physically possible. The psychological damage was severe. The meaningless repetition destroyed sense of purpose. The lack of skill development destroyed hope of improvement. The physical exhaustion destroyed energy for anything else. The constant supervision destroyed autonomy. The work wasn't rehabilitative, it was destructive. Some inmates went mad from the work. The tedium, the pain, the pointlessness. They broke psychologically, were transferred to asylums, or kept in workhouse imbecile ward. The work's psychological damage was predictable, expected, part of deterrence. The work also served humiliation. If you had been skilled craftsman outside, you broke stones inside. If you had been businessman, you picked oakum. Your previous status meant nothing. Everyone did same degrading tasks. This was intentional leveling, stripping dignity, reminding you that you were pauper now. Nothing more. The economic logic was perverse. The work generated some income. Picked oakum sold. Broken stones sold. Laundry contracts paid. But the income was minimal compared to costs of housing, feeding, supervising inmates. The workhouse wasn't profitable. The work wasn't economically rational. It was ideological. It was punishment. It was deterrence through suffering. Reformers occasionally argued for useful training. Teach inmates skills. Prepare them for employment outside. But authorities rejected this. They feared making workhouse attractive. Teaching skills might encourage people to enter, might undermine deterrence. So the work remained pointless, degrading, breaking bodies and spirits, as designed. The labour regime of Victorian workhouse was institutional cruelty. It took vulnerable people desperate for help and broke them further, physically, psychologically, spiritually, all while calling it work, calling it rehabilitation, calling it less eligibility. It was torture, by any honest name. Torture disguised as labour. Chapter 7. Children in Workhouses. Children suffered most in workhouses. They were born into poverty, raised in institutions, destroyed before they had chance at life. At any given time, 25 to 30,000 children lived in British workhouses. Some born there, some brought by desperate parents, some orphaned, all trapped in system designed for adults applied cruelly to children. Children under 7 stayed with mothers if mothers were in workhouse. This was only mercy in classification system, but even this mercy was limited. At 7, boys were taken, moved to boys' ward, separated from mothers completely. The separation was traumatic. 7-year-old torn from only parent, placed with strangers. In institution, already terrifying, made more terrifying by losing mother. Girls could stay with mothers longer, until 16. But separation from fathers happened immediately. Families were broken regardless. Children rarely saw fathers, saw mothers only briefly if at all. The family unit was destroyed by classification. Children born in workhouse knew nothing else. They were born into institutional poverty. Their birth certificates listed workhouse as birthplace. This marked them for life. Workhouse birth was shame. Employers avoided hiring workhouse born. The stigma was permanent. Workhouse children were visibly different from children outside. Smaller, thinner, paler, unhealthier. The diet was inadequate for growth. The conditions were unhealthy. Disease was constant. Children's development was stunted physically by malnutrition and psychologically by institutional life. Child mortality in workhouses was significantly higher than outside. In some workhouses, half of children died before age 5. Malnutrition, disease, neglect. The institutions weren't equipped to care for children properly. They were designed to deter adults. Children suffered collaterally. Infant mortality was worst. Babies born to malnourished mothers, fed inadequately, kept in overcrowded nurseries. Disease spread rapidly. Measles, whooping cough, diarrhea, respiratory infections. The infants died in enormous numbers. Their deaths were recorded, explained as natural, accepted as inevitable. They weren't inevitable. They were a result of institutional neglect. The children who survived infancy faced bleak childhood. The routine started young. Wake at bell, prayers, breakfast, school or work, dinner, work or school, supper, prayers, bed, every day identical, no play, no childhood joy, institutional existence from birth. The education was minimal. The poor law required it, but implementation was poor. Teachers were often inmates themselves, barely literate. Teaching consisted of rote memorization. Alphabet, simple reading, maybe basic arithmetic. Nothing preparing children for skilled employment, just basic literacy, and often not even that. The discipline was harsh. Children were beaten for infractions, caned, strapped, confined. The punishment was sanctioned. Teachers and officials used corporal punishment freely. Children learned obedience through pain, through fear, through submission. The work children performed was real labor, not educational, not play. They worked half days. In workhouse, children over 7 worked. Boys in agricultural work if farms existed, breaking small stones, picking oakum, simple manufacturing. Girls in laundry, kitchen, sewing, cleaning. The work was hard, extended hours, exhausting for developing bodies. Children were also hired out. The workhouse apprenticed children to employers. Factories took workhouse children, farms, workshops. The arrangement was legal slavery. The workhouse signed contracts binding children until 21. The employer paid workhouse, fed and housed child, extracted labor. The children had no choice, no pay, no freedom, just years of forced labor. The apprenticeships were supposed to teach trades, prepare children for independence. In reality, they were exploitation. Factory owners preferred workhouse children. They were cheap, compliant, had no parents to complain. Children worked dangerous machines, suffered injuries, sometimes died. The workhouse system fed industrial capitalism's appetite for child labor. Some apprenticeships were domestic service, girls especially, sent to homes as servants, unpaid until contract ended, often exploited, sometimes abused sexually. The workhouse authorities rarely checked conditions. The children were out of sight, out of mind. Their suffering didn't matter. The psychological damage to children was enormous. Growing up without love, without family, without childhood, in institutions, following rules, obeying authority, never learning independence, never developing identity. The institutional childhood created broken adults. Children who grew up in workhouses often returned as adults. They'd never learned to function independently, never developed skills for outside world. They left workhouse, struggled, failed, returned. The cycle was predictable. The institution created dependency it claimed to prevent. Education reformers argued for better schools in workhouses, for skilled training, for preparation for real employment. Some improvements occurred late Victorian period. District schools were created, separate from workhouses, purpose-built for children. Conditions were better, not good, but better than workhouse. But throughout most of Victorian period, Children suffered in workhouses alongside adults, in same buildings, under same harsh regime, with no accommodation for childhood needs, no play, no affection, no nurture, just institutional survival. The children's voices survive in testimony before parliamentary committees. They described conditions, the hunger, the work, the beatings, the loneliness, the despair. Their testimony is heartbreaking. Children describing adult-level suffering inflicted by institutions supposedly caring for them. Some children ran away, escaped workhouses, preferred streets to institution. Vagabond children, homeless, but free. The fact that children chose homelessness over workhouse reveals how terrible conditions were. Streets were dangerous. Starvation was real. But workhouse was worse. Charles Dickens made workhouse children literary figures. Oliver Twist, born in workhouse, raised in institutional cruelty. His story was fiction, but based on reality. The conditions Dickens described were real. The suffering was real. The child mortality was real. Oliver Twist survived his story. Real workhouse children often didn't. The long-term effects on survivors were permanent. Adults who grew up in workhouses carried trauma forever. They'd missed childhood, missed education, missed family, missed everything that prepares a person for adult life. They were institutionalized, damaged, many never recovered. The Victorian workhouse system's treatment of children was child abuse on industrial scale. Thousands of children, decades of suffering, sanctioned by law, implemented by officials, accepted by society. The children were powerless, voiceless, exploited. The workhouse was supposed to care for vulnerable children. Instead, it destroyed them. Chapter 8: Family Separation. The workhouse's cruelest feature was family separation. It was policy, deliberate, designed. The poor law regulations required separating families by classification: husbands from wives, parents from children over 7, siblings by sex. The rationale was control. Segregation by sex prevented relationships, prevented pregnancy, maintained order. The reality was torture. Families entered workhouse together, walked through gates as unit. Within hours they were divided, sent to separate wards, might not see each other for weeks, months, ever. The separation happened immediately after admission, after bathing, after receiving uniforms, after classification. Husbands directed to men's ward, wives to women's ward, sons over 7 to boys' ward, daughters over 16 to women's ward, younger daughters with mothers, children under 7 with mothers. But the family as unit ceased existing. The separation was traumatic. Wives watched husbands led away, mothers watched sons taken. Fathers saw families divided. The institution tore them apart, justified it as necessary, as regulation, as order. Married couples couldn't be together, couldn't sleep together, couldn't sit together, couldn't talk privately. They lived in the same building, but were strangers. The marriage was suspended during workhouse residence, not legally, but practically. Visiting between wards was forbidden usually. Some workhouses allowed brief meetings weekly, 15 minutes, in supervised room, watched by officials, no privacy, no intimacy, just formal visit between people who were married, who loved each other, who were being punished for poverty by forced separation. Some workhouses were more lenient, allowed couples to walk together in yard on Sundays, still supervised, still limited, but at least contact. Other workhouses prohibited any contact. Husbands and wives lived parallel existences, never intersecting, for months, years. The elderly suffered especially. Couples married 40, 50 years. Old age brought poverty. They entered workhouse together, were immediately separated, spent final years apart. Some never saw each other again before death, died alone in separate wards. The cruelty, was staggering. Children suffered most. 7-year-old boys taken from mothers. The boys didn't understand. They'd done nothing wrong, but were punished by separation, placed in boys' ward with strangers. No mother to comfort them, no father, just institution. The boys cried, begged to see mothers, were told it was against rules, were told to obey. The trauma was severe. Many boys never recovered psychologically. The separation from mother at 7 became defining trauma of their lives. Mothers suffered watching sons taken. They'd protected them, loved them. Suddenly their sons were gone, taken by officials, placed somewhere in building, but unreachable. The mothers grieved, like death, but worse because the child was alive, just forbidden. Some mothers saw sons briefly, passing in corridor, across chapel. The brief glimpses were torture, so close, but untouchable. The officials enforced separation strictly. Mother who tried to speak to son faced punishment, loss of food, solitary confinement. The rules were absolute. Fathers separated from families entirely. They entered workhouse with wife and children, were immediately taken to men's ward, saw none of them. The father's role was destroyed. He couldn't provide, couldn't protect, couldn't parent. He was just another inmate in men's ward. His family existed somewhere else. He was powerless to help them. Siblings were separated too, brothers from sisters, older siblings from younger. The bonds of siblinghood were severed by classification. A boy with 2 sisters might never see them during workhouse residence, separated by sex, by age, by regulations. The separation policy was justified as moral protection. Authorities claimed separation prevented sexual immorality, prevented pregnancies that would increase workhouse costs. The obsession with controlling sexuality outweighed any consideration of family bonds, of marriage, of parenting, of love. But pregnancy happened anyway. Staff sometimes abused female inmates sexually. Male inmates sometimes got access to women's wards. The separation policy didn't prevent sexual contact. It just prevented married couples from being together while allowing predatory behavior. Women who became pregnant in workhouse faced harsh judgment. They were blamed, punished, regardless of circumstances, regardless of whether it was abuse or assault. Pregnancy was treated as moral failing, as rule violation. The woman suffered. The man usually wasn't punished. The double standard was extreme. The babies born from these pregnancies were workhouse children, born into separation, born into institutional poverty, born to mothers who were inmates, who were powerless, who were stigmatized. The babies' fathers were often unknown, or known but unpunishable because they were officials. Some couples tried to maintain relationships despite separation. They found ways to communicate, left notes, whispered in chapel, stole glances across yards. These small resistances were all they had. The institution tried to eliminate even these, punished discovery. But love persisted, even in workhouse. Some couples were broken by separation. After months or years apart, the relationship withered. The emotional connection died. They became strangers. When they eventually left workhouse, they separated. The institution had destroyed their marriage. This happened frequently. The workhouse killed relationships. The separation policy had no evidence supporting it. It wasn't more efficient, didn't save money significantly, didn't improve outcomes. It existed purely for moral control, for discipline, for punishment, to make workhouse unendurable so people would avoid it. And people did avoid it. Families starved together outside rather than be separated inside. The policy worked as deterrent, but the cost was families destroyed, children traumatized, marriages ended, elderly couples dying alone, all because policy prioritized sexual control over human compassion. Reformers attacked separation policy, argued families should stay together, that married couples should have privacy, that children shouldn't be taken from mothers. The arguments were moral. They were also practical. Family separation wasn't necessary. Many foreign systems didn't separate families. They functioned fine. But British authorities insisted on separation. They defended it passionately. Any weakening of separation rules was treated as dangerous, as encouraging pauperism, as undermining deterrence. The ideology was rigid, impervious to evidence, indifferent to suffering. Some reforms eventually occurred. Late Victorian periods saw relaxation of strictest rules. Some workhouses allowed more family contact, created family visiting rooms, allowed married couples to walk together. These were small mercies, not fundamental change, but marginally better than absolute separation. The separation policy wasn't abolished until workhouses themselves ended. The system maintained family separation as core feature until death. Over a century of marriages interrupted, parents separated from children, families torn apart, all in name of less eligibility, of deterrence, of moral control. The family separation policy of Victorian workhouse was institutional cruelty, targeting love itself, taking people who loved each other, who committed no crime, whose only failing was poverty, and separating them, not for their good, not for any rational purpose, but as punishment, as deterrence, as policy. The separation destroyed families. That was its purpose. It succeeded. Chapter 9. Punishment and Abuse. Punishment in workhouse was harsh, officially sanctioned, frequently abused. The master had enormous power, the inmates had none. The poor law authorized punishment for rule violations, reduction of food, solitary confinement, separation from other inmates, physical punishment for children. These were legal penalties, applied at master's discretion. The master's power was nearly absolute. He decided violations, decided punishments, answered to Board of Guardians. But guardians met infrequently and usually supported master. Appeals were impossible practically. The master was dictator of his small kingdom. Food reduction was common punishment. Inmate who broke rule got reduced rations. Already inadequate food became starvation. For days, week. The punishment was severe. You were hungry always. Punishment made you starving. The physical suffering was extreme. Some masters used food creatively as punishment, making inmates eat unpalatable food, forcing them to eat in humiliating ways, standing while eating, eating from floor. The degradation added to physical deprivation. Solitary confinement was standard punishment for serious violations. The punishment cells were dark, unheated, small. You were locked inside alone for hours, days, sometimes weeks, with minimal food, no contact, no light, no comfort, just darkness and isolation. The psychological effects of solitary were severe. People went mad in punishment cells, had breakdowns. The isolation was torture, recognized as such, but used anyway. It was cheap, effective, terrifying to others. Some punishment cells were just closets, barely large enough to stand, too small to sit. You stood in darkness for hours. Your legs weakened. You collapsed, remained crumpled in tiny space until released. This was legal punishment. Physical punishment was authorized for children. Caning, strapping, beating with implements. The blows were hard, left marks, caused pain. The justification was discipline, teaching obedience, preparing children for employment. The reality was violence against vulnerable children. Teachers beat students for academic failures, for behavioral issues, for talking, for any violation. The beatings were routine, expected. Children learned through pain, through fear, through submission to authority that could hurt them. Masters beat adult inmates too. This wasn't officially authorized, but happened. Masters had absolute power, no cameras, no witnesses who mattered. Inmates who complained faced more punishment. The masters were untouchable. Some beatings were severe, causing injuries, sometimes permanent damage, occasionally death. The deaths were explained as accidents, as natural causes. The masters were rarely held accountable. Their word was trusted over inmates. Sexual abuse happened in workhouses. Male officials abused female inmates. The women were powerless to resist. Refusal meant punishment. Reporting meant not being believed. The officials were respected. The inmates were paupers. Who would believe them? Pregnant women in workhouse were often pregnancy from staff abuse, but blamed for immorality, punished for becoming pregnant. The abuser continued his position. The woman suffered. The power imbalance made consent impossible. But authorities didn't care. Young girls were especially vulnerable. Workhouse girls had no parents to protect them. Officials knew this. Some exploited it. The abuse was covered up. The girls were blamed, called seducers, treated as criminals. The pattern was predictable, preventable, ignored. Some workhouse masters were sadists. They enjoyed inflicting pain, degrading inmates, exercising absolute power. The workhouse system attracted such people, offered them unlimited authority over powerless population. Some masters were decent, some were monsters. The Andover workhouse scandal included abuse beyond starvation. The master, Colin McDougall, beat inmates savagely, humiliated them, created reign of terror. Inmates were afraid to complain. When investigation finally occurred, extent of abuse shocked Parliament. But McDougall was exception only in being caught. Abuse was widespread. Female staff abused inmates too. Matrons who supervised women's wards. Some were cruel. Denied food arbitrarily, inflicted punishments excessively, enjoyed power over vulnerable women. The matron was often master's wife. She had similar authority, similar impunity. Medical officers sometimes abused authority, declaring inmates fit for work when they were sick, refusing treatment, experimenting on inmates without consent. The medical care was minimal anyway. Some doctors made it worse through neglect or active harm. The casual violence was pervasive. Officials striking inmates for minor infractions, shoving them, grabbing them roughly. The message was clear. You were object, not person. You could be handled roughly because you were pauper. Your body wasn't yours. It was workhouse property. Inmates resisted sometimes, fought back. This brought severe punishment, but some fought anyway. Out of anger, out of dignity, out of refusing to be broken completely. The resistance was usually futile, but it preserved some humanity, some self-respect, some refusal to submit. Riots occurred occasionally, groups of inmates revolting against conditions, against abuse, against starvation. The riots were suppressed violently. Military called in sometimes. Rioters were prosecuted, given prison sentences. But the riots revealed depth of suffering, degree of anger, the desperation that made even futile resistance worthwhile. The punishment and abuse in workhouses were possible because inmates had no rights, no legal protections, no recourse. They were subject to absolute authority. Their testimony wasn't believed. Their complaints were ignored. They were paupers. Their suffering didn't matter. Some reformers documented abuse. Charles Dickens, investigative journalists, sympathetic doctors. Parliamentary committees occasionally investigated specific scandals. The evidence was overwhelming. The system enabled abuse, encouraged it even, by granting unlimited power without accountability. But fundamental change was slow. Scandals led to individual masters being fired. Occasionally, usually they were protected, transferred, given new positions. The system protected abusers. It was designed to. Because authorities fundamentally believed paupers deserved harsh treatment, deserved punishment. deserved suffering. The psychological abuse was perhaps worse than physical. The constant degradation, the institutional humiliation, the loss of identity, the powerlessness, the knowledge that you were hated, that society considered you waste, that you were being punished for poverty, for circumstances often beyond your control. The psychological damage was permanent. Many former inmates carried trauma forever. They'd been broken in workhouse, through punishment, through abuse, through systematic degradation. They survived, but never recovered. The institutional damage was irreversible. The punishment and abuse in Victorian workhouse was institutional violence, sanctioned by law, enabled by power imbalance, protected by authority. It destroyed people, broke them, sometimes killed them, all while being called discipline, called necessary, called justified. It was torture, state-sanctioned torture of the poor. Chapter 10. Workhouse Scandals. Scandals erupted periodically. The abuses were too extreme to hide completely. The investigations revealed system's true nature. The horror, the cruelty, the deaths. The Andover workhouse scandal of 1846 was most famous, most damaging. It exposed starvation and brutality, led to Poor Law Commission's abolition, changed system, but not enough. Andover Workhouse in Hampshire had Colin McDougall as master. He was cruel. His wife was matron, also cruel. Together they ran regime of terror. They reduced food below regulations, kept the difference, starved inmates while profiting. The inmates were so hungry, they fought over bones they were crushing, old bones from knackers' yards. The inmates were supposed to crush them for fertilizer, but they were starving. They sucked the bones, ate the rotting marrow, gnawed the gristle, fought over scraps of decayed meat. This wasn't animal behavior. It was starvation, human desperation. The bones were putrid, diseased. The inmates ate them anyway, because McDougall had reduced their rations to near starvation, while pocketing food money. The scandal broke when former inmate testified before parliamentary committee, described the bone eating, the beatings, the starvation. Parliament was horrified. Investigation followed. The revelations were damning. McDougall had beaten inmates regularly, used bone as weapon, struck them for minor infractions, created climate of fear. Inmates were terrified to complain. Those who did were punished worse. His wife had punished female inmates cruelly, denied food, locked women in punishment cells for extended periods, particularly targeted pregnant women. The abuse was systematic, deliberate, enjoyed. The investigation found multiple violations: starvation diet, excessive punishment, embezzlement, cruelty. The evidence was overwhelming, but McDougall was defended by some guardians. They claimed he was enforcing discipline, maintaining order, deterring pauperism. The scandal became national crisis. It revealed workhouse system's cruelty. The public was shocked. Parliament was embarrassed. The Poor Law Commission had failed to prevent this, had failed to supervise adequately, had failed fundamentally. The result was Poor Law Commission's abolition, replaced with Poor Law Board answering directly to Parliament. More oversight, more accountability. Some regulations improved. Dietary standards raised slightly, but the fundamental system continued. The deterrence principle remained. McDougall was dismissed, not prosecuted. He found other employment. His wife similarly. They faced no real consequences for years of abuse, for starving hundreds, for beating them, for driving them to eat rotting bone marrow. Because pauper testimony didn't matter enough. The Andover scandal wasn't isolated. It was exceptional only in exposure. Other workhouses had similar abuses. The system enabled them, encouraged them even. Andover revealed truth, sparked brief outrage. Then business continued mostly unchanged. Huddersfield Workhouse in 1848 had scandal. Master found guilty of serious abuse, embezzlement, sexual impropriety with female inmates. He'd created harem essentially, using his power to coerce women. The women had no choice, no protection, no recourse. The investigation found he'd impregnated multiple inmates. All were blamed, punished. He was dismissed, but not prosecuted for sexual assault, because the women were paupers. Their sexual violation didn't matter legally. He faced consequences for financial crimes, not for rape. St. Pancras Workhouse in London had recurring scandals: overcrowding, disease, abuse, deaths from neglect. The problems were documented repeatedly. Investigations occurred, reports were written. Little changed. The workhouse continued operating. The scandals continued recurring. Many workhouses had similar patterns: periodic scandals, investigations, reports, minor reforms, then return to abuse. The cycle repeated because fundamental problems weren't addressed. The system was designed to deter. Abuse was feature, not bug. Infant mortality scandals erupted regularly. Workhouses where half the babies died. The deaths were initially explained as natural, inevitable, but investigations found neglect, inadequate care, untrained staff, preventable deaths. The scandals would lead to dismissals, new staff, same results, because the system didn't prioritize child welfare. Medical neglect scandals occurred frequently, inmates dying from treatable conditions, because medical officer was negligent, or because treatment was denied to save costs. The deaths were documented, sometimes investigated, rarely prevented. Punishment cell deaths happened, inmates dying in solitary confinement, from cold, from neglect, from pre-existing conditions worsened by isolation. The deaths were usually ruled accidental, natural causes. Rarely were officials held accountable. Some scandals involved financial corruption, masters embezzling, guardians awarding contracts to themselves, food suppliers delivering spoiled goods. The corruption was widespread. The oversight was minimal. The opportunities were numerous. Other scandals involved religious discrimination. Catholic inmates in Protestant workhouses forced to attend Protestant services. Jewish inmates denied appropriate food. The religious minorities were particular targets of abuse. Sexual abuse scandals erupted periodically, as in Huddersfield, officials preying on female inmates. The pattern was depressingly consistent: powerful men, powerless women, abuse, pregnancy, women blamed, men protected. The system enabled sexual predators. Mental health scandals revealed horrible treatment of mentally ill inmates, chained, beaten, neglected. The imbecile wards were often worst places in workhouse. Minimal care, maximum suffering. Occasional investigations revealed horror, did little to fix it. Each scandal followed similar pattern: horror revealed, brief outrage, investigation, report, minor reforms, return to previous conditions. The cycle repeated because society didn't actually care enough to fix system. The scandals were embarrassing, but not sufficiently embarrassing to end workhouses. The newspapers covered scandals enthusiastically, the Times especially. They documented abuses, gave voice to victims, created public pressure. But public memory was short. After each scandal faded, attention moved elsewhere. Workhouses continued. Charles Dickens used scandals as material. Oliver Twist was partly based on Cleveland Street workhouse scandal. Dickens turned scandals into literature, into permanent record. His fiction preserved truth of workhouse horror better than parliamentary reports. The scandals revealed that workhouse system was fundamentally abusive, not just in cases of bad masters, but systematically. The structure enabled abuse, the ideology justified it, the oversight failed to prevent it. The scandals were symptoms. The disease was workhouse system itself. Late Victorian period saw continued scandals. Each decade brought new revelations, new horrors. The investigations accumulated, the evidence mounted. Yet workhouses continued operating until the 20th century. Until National Health Service, until national assistance, until comprehensive welfare state replaced punitive poor law. The scandals were crucial. They preserved evidence, documented suffering, gave voice to voiceless, created pressure for reform. The reforms came slowly, incrementally, insufficiently, but the scandals kept abuse in public consciousness, prevented complete denial, made impossible to claim workhouses were functioning well. The Victorian workhouse scandals revealed institutional cruelty on massive scale, starvation, beatings, sexual abuse, child neglect, medical negligence, financial corruption, all sanctioned by system designed to punish poverty. The scandals should have ended workhouses. They didn't. But they documented the crime, preserved evidence for history to judge. Chapter 11: Death and the Anatomy Act. Death was constant in workhouses. The elderly died, the sick died, children died. The workhouse was where the poor went to die. The mortality rates were higher than outside. Malnutrition weakened everyone. Disease spread easily in overcrowded wards. Medical care was minimal. The vulnerable died regularly. Infant mortality was highest. In some workhouses, 50% of babies died. From malnutrition, from disease, from neglect. The babies were born to malnourished mothers, fed inadequately, kept in overcrowded nurseries. Disease swept through. Measles, whooping cough, diarrhea. The babies died in enormous numbers. The mothers watched helplessly. Their babies dying. They couldn't provide better care, couldn't supplement inadequate milk, couldn't protect from disease. They were inmates, powerless. They watched their babies waste, sicken, die. The grief was enormous, compounded by powerlessness. Elderly died frequently. They entered workhouse in final years, aged, infirm, unable to work. The workhouse was their end. They died in aged and infirm wards, often alone, separated from spouses, from family, dying in institution. The deaths were recorded, bodies processed, buried in pauper graves. The sick died from treatable conditions, because medical care was inadequate, because doctors visited infrequently, because treatment was denied to save costs. Tuberculosis killed many, typhoid, cholera, pneumonia, infections, all treatable potentially, all lethal in workhouse. The infirmary wards were death wards, overcrowded, understaffed. The sick were placed there to die. Some recovered, many didn't. The infirmary had minimal nursing, minimal supplies, minimal care. It was place to die, not place to heal. Some inmates died from injuries, workplace accidents, falls, the elderly falling, breaking bones, developing infections. The injuries that outside might be minor became fatal in workhouse because care was inadequate, because bodies were weakened by malnutrition. Some died from punishment, in solitary confinement, from reduced food, from beating. The deaths were usually explained as natural, accidental, rarely investigated properly. The officials weren't held accountable. The deaths were just statistics. Suicide occurred. Inmates hanged themselves, drowned themselves, poisoned themselves. The despair was overwhelming. The suffering was unbearable. Death seemed preferable. The suicides were recorded, explained as insanity, as moral weakness, not as a result of institutional cruelty. When inmate died, the body was processed efficiently. Death recorded in register. Cause noted, usually vague. Natural causes. Debility. Old age. Specific conditions rarely documented. Medical officer signed death certificate, often without examining body closely. The body was washed, prepared for burial, by other inmates usually. Women's task, washing the dead, wrapping them, The bodies accumulated. Death was routine, expected, managed bureaucratically. Burial was in pauper graves, unmarked usually, multiple bodies per grave, buried quickly, minimal ceremony, sometimes no ceremony, just interment. The graves were in corners of cemeteries, cheap land, undesirable locations. The burial reflected life, poor in death as in life. Workhouse graveyards were grim, mass graves, hundreds buried without headstones, without names, just numbers in register. The graveyards remain, some preserved, most forgotten, containing thousands of unknown poor who died in institutions. Family wasn't notified always. If inmate died and family was outside, they might not learn immediately. Sometimes not at all. Bodies were buried before family could come. The poor couldn't afford funerals anyway. The workhouse burials saved them cost. That was rationale. For those who died without family, the body had another fate. The Anatomy Act of 1832 authorized using unclaimed bodies for medical dissection. Bodies from workhouses qualified. If no one claimed body within time period, it went to medical schools. The Anatomy Act was passed to stop body snatching, resurrection men, Burke and Hare murders. By providing legal supply of bodies to medical schools, the poor's bodies, specifically, bodies of those who died in institutions, the Act essentially said, die in workhouse, be dissected. The poor understood this. They feared workhouse partly because of it. Dying in workhouse meant body stolen for dissection, cut apart by medical students, dismembered. The fear was enormous, cultural, religious. The thought of body violated after death was horror. The anatomy schools received regular supply from workhouses. Bodies delivered, payment rendered. The bodies were dissected for anatomical instruction, cut apart, organs removed, skeletons preserved sometimes for display. The dissection destroyed body completely. No burial afterward, just disposal. Some bodies were displayed, skeletons mounted, preserved organs in jars, teaching specimens. The poor who died in workhouse might end up displayed in medical museum, their poverty continuing after death, their bodies educational tools. The dissection trade created perverse incentive. Medical schools paid for bodies. Workhouses received income. The more inmates who died unclaimed, the more income. This created conflict of interest. Not provable that officials hastened deaths for income, but the incentive existed. The poor desperately tried to avoid workhouse partly because of anatomy fear. Families would claim bodies even if couldn't afford burial, just to prevent dissection. The fear shaped behavior, motivated avoiding workhouse, accepting any alternative. Some burial clubs existed specifically to ensure proper burial. Working people paid weekly pennies. The club paid for funeral when member died, including if died in workhouse. The clubs were partially motivated by anatomy fear, ensuring members' bodies weren't dissected. The Anatomy Act remained in force throughout Victorian period, continued into 20th century. Thousands of workhouse bodies were dissected. The poor provided medical education materials. Their poverty useful even in death, their bodies commodified, exploited. The Act was reformed eventually, extended to include voluntary donation. But for decades it essentially meant, die poor, die in institution, be dissected. The class dimension was obvious. Wealthy weren't dissected. Their bodies were buried with dignity. Poor were cut apart. The death rate in workhouses was scandal, but continuous scandal. Always present, always documented, seldom changed. Thousands died annually in British workhouses, from preventable causes, from neglect, from institutional cruelty. Their deaths were recorded, explained as natural, accepted as inevitable. The dead were forgotten quickly, names in registers, bodies in pauper graves or on dissection tables, the forgotten poor, who died in institutions, who were buried without ceremony or dissected without consent. The death toll over century was hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, all dying in poverty, in institutions, unmourned, uncounted, uncared for. Death in workhouse was final indignity, final proof of complete failure. You'd failed in life, failed to avoid poverty, failed to stay independent, failed to die anywhere better. Your death was pauper's death, in institution, your body pauper's body, disposed of cheaply, or sold for dissection. The Victorians spoke of good death, dying at home, surrounded by family, with religious comfort, proper burial. The workhouse death was opposite, dying in institution, separated from family, minimal spiritual care, pauper burial or dissection. The bad death, the death that represented complete social failure. Yet hundreds of thousands died this way, not because they were failures, but because system failed them, economy failed them, society failed them. They died in workhouses because Victorian Britain chose to punish poverty rather than alleviate it. Their deaths were policy outcomes, not natural occurrences, results of deliberate choices about how to treat the poor. Chapter 12. Resistance, Reform and Abolition. The poor didn't accept workhouses passively. They resisted. From the beginning through the end, resistance took many forms: riots, arson, escapes, everyday defiance. The anti-poor law movement began before workhouses were even built. When the Act of 1834 passed, working people understood immediately what it meant. They organised, protested, rioted. In northern England, industrial workers were particularly militant. They saw workhouse system as attack on their security, as attempt to drive down wages by removing outdoor relief alternative. They fought back. The Todmorden riots of 1838 were violent. Crowds attacked workhouse, broke windows, tried to burn it. Guardians fled. Military was called. The riot was suppressed. But the resistance continued. Similar riots occurred across industrial North, Bradford, Oldham, Dewsbury. The pattern was consistent. Announcement that workhouse would be built or workhouse test imposed. Popular resistance, demonstrations, violence, military suppression. The resistance delayed implementation. In some areas for years, guardians were afraid to enforce new poor law. Mobs threatened them, attacked their property. Some guardians resigned rather than implement hated system. The Chartists, working-class political movement, incorporated anti-poor law demands. They saw workhouse system as class oppression, as attack on working people, as attempt to destroy working-class families. They were right. Women were active in resistance. Wives of workers organised, protested. Women understood family separation viscerally, understood threat to their children. They fought guardians, physically sometimes. The women's resistance was fierce. Some resistance was violent. Arson. Workhouse buildings burned, sometimes deliberately, sometimes during riots. The authorities blamed agitators, but the fires were popular resistance, destroying symbols of oppression. Other resistance was subtle, everyday defiance, inmates breaking rules, refusing work, feigning illness, talking when forbidden. These were small acts, but they preserved dignity, maintained humanity, refused complete submission. Escapes happened regularly. Inmates fled workhouses, climbed walls, broke windows, left during work details outside. The escapes were rarely successful long-term. You were caught, returned, punished. But people tried anyway. Freedom was worth the attempt. Some inmates organised inside workhouse, secret meetings, planning collective action, work slowdowns, coordinated rule-breaking. The organisation was difficult. Officials watched constantly. Informers existed, but resistance emerged anyway. The workhouse riots were internal rebellions. Groups of inmates revolting, taking over building briefly, demanding better conditions, better food, family contact. The riots were suppressed violently, but they revealed depth of suffering, degree of anger. Women rioted too, particularly about food, about family separation. Women's riots were often spontaneous, explosive, born of accumulated desperation. The authorities found women rioters particularly threatening. Women weren't supposed to be violent. Their resistance violated gender norms, made it more dangerous symbolically. Children resisted, ran away, refused work, fought back against beatings. The resistance was often futile. Children had least power, but they tried. Their resistance preserved some agency, some self-respect. The resistance influenced reform, not directly, but constant pressure, constant reminder that system was hated, unsustainable without force. The resistance made workhouse system expensive, required police, military sometimes, made officials nervous. This mattered. Reform came slowly, incrementally, reluctantly. The Poor Law Board made minor improvements after Andover scandal. Dietary standards raised slightly, more oversight, but fundamental system unchanged. Medical reform advanced gradually. The workhouse infirmaries slowly improved. By late Victorian period, some became decent hospitals, serving not just paupers, but working poor. This wasn't intentional, but need for medical facilities exceeded ideological resistance. Education in workhouses improved somewhat. District schools separated children from workhouses, gave them better environment. Education improved marginally, still inadequate, but better than early system. Family separation rules relaxed slightly. Some workhouses allowed more contact, created family visiting areas. These were small mercies, but improvements nonetheless, resulting from pressure, from criticism, from scandals. The broader reform movements influenced workhouse system, public health movement, medical reform, social reform, journalists documenting poverty, social investigators like Charles Booth. Their work revealed workhouse cruelty, created pressure for change. Trade unions fought workhouse system, saw it as weapon against wages, against worker security. Unions supported resistance, organized opposition, used political pressure. As unions strengthened late Victorian period, they influenced poor law policy. Women's movements addressed workhouse issues, particularly family separation, particularly conditions for women inmates. Female reformers fought for improvements. Their efforts gradually affected policy. Socialist movement attacked workhouse system fundamentally. Socialists argued poverty wasn't individual failing, was systemic, product of capitalism. They demanded end to deterrent approach, proper relief as right. This ideological challenge eventually influenced policy. World War I changed everything. The war required total mobilization. Workers were essential. Poverty was recognized as weakness. The punitive poor law seemed outdated, inefficient. The war started shift toward welfare state. The Local Government Act of 1929 began ending poor law system. Workhouses were transferred to local authorities, still operated but under different administration. The deterrence principle was officially abandoned. Finally, the workhouses became public assistance institutions, then hospitals, then administrative buildings. The system lingered until after World War II, but its ideology was dead. Killed by resistance, by reform, by changing society. The National Assistance Act of 1948 formally ended poor law, created welfare state, abolished workhouses legally, ended century plus of institutionalized punishment of poverty. The workhouses closed, buildings were converted, some demolished, era ended. The abolition came from multiple sources, working class resistance throughout, reform movements, changing ideology, economic needs, political pressure. World wars revealing old systems' inadequacy. The combination finally ended workhouses, but the legacy remained, buildings still standing, institutional descendants still existing, memory of workhouse still haunting British poor, stories passed down, terror remembered. The Victorian workhouse left permanent scar on British consciousness. The resistance, reform, and eventual abolition proved one thing. The workhouse system wasn't inevitable. It was choice, bad choice, made by Parliament, supported by wealthy, imposed on poor. The resistance showed it was wrong from beginning. The reform showed it could be changed. The abolition showed it should have ended much sooner. The Victorian workhouse existed for centuries, but was fought for centuries by those inside, by their families outside, by sympathetic reformers, by working class movements, by everyone who saw its cruelty and refused to accept it as natural, as necessary, as inevitable. The resistance didn't end workhouses quickly, but kept hope alive, kept humanity alive, kept possibility of change alive. The reformers didn't fix system immediately, but pushed constantly, documented suffering, created pressure. The combination eventually succeeded. The workhouse system's abolition was victory, hard won, long delayed, incomplete, but real. The poor law was ended. The workhouses were closed. The deterrence through suffering was abandoned. New system emerged, imperfect, but better, based on rights, on support, on recognition that poverty wasn't crime to punish. The resistance, reform, and abolition took over a century. Millions suffered meanwhile. Hundreds of thousands died in workhouses. But eventually, the system that punished poverty ended, replaced by system attempting to alleviate it. The change came from resistance, from refusing to accept cruelty as policy, from fighting back, however long it took. Chapter 13. Conclusion. Britain's shame. The Victorian workhouse was deliberate cruelty, not accident, not unfortunate necessity, calculated policy, designed suffering, institutionalized punishment of poverty. The system operated for over a century, from 1834 to 1948. Officially, workhouses continued operating in various forms even longer. Over this period, millions of people cycled through. Hundreds of thousands died inside. Countless families were destroyed. The human cost was staggering. The workhouse wasn't aberration. It was logical outcome of Victorian values, self-reliance, individual responsibility, free market principles. When these were applied ruthlessly to poverty, workhouse resulted. When you believe poverty is moral failing, when you think suffering motivates work, when you prioritize deterrence over help, you create workhouse. The architects knew exactly what they were building. Edwin Chadwick and other poor law reformers explicitly designed suffering. They wrote about it, defended it, celebrated it. They believed making poverty miserable would eliminate poverty. They were wrong, but they implemented their beliefs anyway. The result was institutional hell, family separation, starvation diet, forced labor, child suffering, death, all sanctioned by law, all implemented by respectable officials, all accepted by society. For generations, the workhouse succeeded in its stated goal. It deterred. People avoided it desperately. They starved rather than enter, died in streets rather than surrender to separation, endured terrible conditions outside rather than accept institutional control. The deterrence worked, but deterrence didn't solve poverty. It just made poor people suffer more. Poverty continued, unemployment continued, illness continued, age continued. The economic causes of poverty weren't addressed by making workhouse horrible. They required different solutions: economic change, social insurance, public health, education, employment programs, things Victorian Britain largely refused to provide. Instead, the solution was punishment. The workhouse, where poor went when they'd exhausted all alternatives, where they were broken, where many died. The system served capitalism's needs, kept labor compliant, kept poor rates low, protected wealthy from having to support poor adequately, but it destroyed lives. The children suffered most, born into institutional poverty, raised without love, without family, without childhood, stunted by malnutrition, damaged by abuse, unprepared for life. Many died young. Those who survived carried trauma forever. The workhouse destroyed childhoods by tens of thousands. This alone should condemn system. The elderly suffered too, after lifetime of work, after contributing to society, after raising families. Old age brought poverty, and poverty brought workhouse. They died there, separated from spouses, from children, from dignity, buried in pauper graves, forgotten. This was reward for long life. The women suffered unique cruelties, controlled more completely, separated from children more traumatically, vulnerable to sexual abuse, subject to gendered expectations. The workhouse was particularly harsh for women. The patriarchy and class oppression combined brutally. The men suffered loss of role, couldn't provide, couldn't protect, couldn't parent. The workhouse destroyed masculine identity as it destroyed families. The men were reduced to labor units, breaking stones, picking oakum, grinding corn, pointless work destroying bodies and spirits. The system enabled abuse by design, giving absolute power to masters, creating powerless population of inmates. No oversight, no accountability, no recourse. Abuse was inevitable, predictable. It happened constantly, everywhere. The scandals that emerged were a tiny fraction of total abuse. The death toll was enormous. Exact numbers are difficult. Records were incomplete. Causes of death were vague. But hundreds of thousands died in workhouses over century, from malnutrition, from disease, from neglect, from despair. These weren't natural deaths. They were policy outcomes. The workhouse system's legacy is complex. It created institutions. Some became hospitals. Some became schools. The infrastructure sometimes served better purposes later. But the human cost can't be offset by architectural legacy. The workhouse influenced British culture deeply. The fear remained for generations. In the workhouse was threat, was shame, was social death. The memory shaped working class culture, shaped labor movement, shaped demands for welfare state. The horror was so complete it motivated building alternative system. The workhouse proved that poverty could be managed institutionally, for better and worse. The infrastructure of welfare state partially built on workhouse foundations. The local government structures, the administrative systems, the institutional experience. These influenced how 20th century Britain built alternatives, but mainly the workhouse taught what not to do, how not to treat poverty, how not to organize relief, how not to structure institutions. The workhouse was a negative example. Its failures guided reform. Its cruelty motivated compassion. Its abolition enabled new beginning. Charles Dickens ensured workhouse wouldn't be forgotten. Oliver Twist preserved the horror in literature. Other writers followed. The workhouse became symbol of Victorian hypocrisy, of industrial capitalism's cruelty, of class oppression. The literary legacy kept memory alive. The buildings remain as witnesses, converted, repurposed, but recognizable. Victorian workhouse architecture is distinctive. When you see those buildings, you remember what happened there, who suffered there, who died there. The buildings are monuments, not to pride, to shame. The graveyards remain too. Some maintained, most forgotten. Thousands buried without markers, without names. The dead testify to system that killed them, to society that allowed it, to century of cruelty. The graves are evidence of Britain's shame. Modern Britain inherited this legacy. The welfare state was built partly in reaction to workhouse, National Health Service, national insurance, social security, all designed to prevent return to Victorian cruelty, to provide help, not punishment, support, not deterrence. The workhouse's abolition enabled building something better, but the ideology never completely died. Arguments for deterring benefit claimants, for testing genuineness of need, for less eligibility, for making poverty uncomfortable. These echo workhouse logic. The Victorian justifications resurface. The temptation to punish poverty persists. The Victorian workhouse must be remembered, not as curiosity, not as unfortunate historical necessity, as deliberate cruelty, as policy choice, as what happens when society decides to punish rather than help the vulnerable, as warning. The workhouse showed that institutions can destroy people, that power without accountability enables abuse, that economic ideology can justify enormous suffering, that society can accept cruelty if it's legal, if it's organized, if it's called policy. The workhouse proved poverty isn't solved by making poor people suffer, that family separation doesn't help families, that starvation doesn't encourage productivity, that institutional control doesn't create independence, that punishment doesn't eliminate poverty. Every claim justifying workhouse system was wrong. History proved it. The people who suffered in workhouses deserve remembering. The families separated, the children institutionalized, the elderly dying alone, the women abused, the men broken, the thousands who died. They weren't statistics. They were people, with names, with histories, with families who mourned them, with lives destroyed by policy. Their suffering wasn't inevitable, wasn't natural, wasn't necessary. It was chosen by Parliament, by guardians, by officials, by society. Different choices were possible. Outdoor relief could have continued. Support could have been generous. Families could have stayed together. The poor could have been helped, not punished. The Victorian workhouse was Britain's shame. It was century-long crime against the poor, sanctioned by law, implemented by institutions, accepted by society. It destroyed millions of lives, killed hundreds of thousands, traumatized generations, all in name of deterrence, of less eligibility, of self-reliance. We remember, not to judge Victorians as uniquely cruel, but to recognize that cruelty can be systematic, institutional, legal, socially acceptable, and still wrong. The workhouse teaches that legal doesn't mean just, that popular doesn't mean right, that long-standing doesn't mean inevitable. The Victorian workhouse ended, but only after a century of suffering, only after enormous resistance, only after social, economic, and political change made it impossible to continue. Its ending wasn't automatic, wasn't inevitable, was fought for by working people, by reformers, by everyone who refused to accept institutional cruelty as natural. The lesson is clear. Systems of cruelty must be resisted, must be documented, must be remembered, must be abolished. The Victorian workhouse was one such system. It existed, it harmed, it ended. We remember, so it never returns. This was the Victorian workhouse. Institutional punishment of poverty, family separation, starvation, forced labor, child suffering, death, abuse, scandal, resistance, reform, abolition, century of suffering. Britain's shame. May it never be repeated. The workhouse is gone. The buildings remain. The graves remain. The memory remains. We remember the victims. We condemn the system. We learn the lesson. Poverty should be alleviated, not punished. People should be helped, not broken. Families should be supported, not separated. Children should be protected, not exploited. The Victorian workhouse taught these lessons through suffering, through death, through century of institutionalized cruelty. We honor the victims by remembering, by learning, by ensuring it never happens again. This is the complete history of Victorian workhouses. Not simplified, not sanitized, not defended, the truth, in all its horror. So we never forget what happened, who suffered, why it was wrong, and why it must never return.